to come all the way across the country and see this culture being regenerated with an understanding of its history and its background and its Christian history and the biblical principles which underlie our republic. So I am very emotional at the moment. I have goosebumps just to be with you people. I really admire you. I feel it's an honor to be in this historic room. Now, I want to begin my remarks, and actually to do that, I want to tell you a story to begin. And to tell you that story, I actually have to leave the podium for a moment, so stay right there. Don't go away. I'll try not to walk in front of that speaker again with my microphone turned on down. Sorry for that. You all know Neil Davis? Anybody in the room not know Neil Davis? He's a pretty excitable guy, isn't he? Always really on the edge of his emotions, right? Can't keep himself in check. He called me a couple of weeks ago. And he said, Michael, you got to write me a song. And I said, what about? And he said that he had read something the night before which so unnerved him and so worried him that he actually counted the hours, because I live on the East Coast and he's here, until he could call me and tell me to write this song. And I said, this sounds like pretty serious stuff. What did you read? And when he told me, I have to admit to you that a tingle of terror went down my spine. And I said, Neil, I'm your man. I'll write this song. I'm not sure I'm equal to the task. But the people need to know. The people need to be warned. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you just might consider this your only warning. Humankind has survived some disasters for sure, like locusts, and flash floods, and flu. There's never a moment when we've been secure from the ills that the flesh is there too. If it isn't a war, it's some gruesome disease. If it isn't disease, then it's war. And there's worse yet to come, so I'm asking you please, how the world's gonna take any more? You ready? In 10 years we're gonna have 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers. 10 years we're gonna have 1 million lawyers. How much can the poor nation stand? Everybody, ready? In 10 years we're gonna have 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers. In 10 years we're gonna have 1 million lawyers. How much can the poor nation stand? Well, the world shook with dread when Attila the Hun, he conquered with fire and steel. And Genghis and Kubla and all of the Khans ground a groaning world under the heel. Disaster, disaster, so what else is new? We've conquered the worst and then some. So I'm sorry to tell you, my suffering friends, of the terrible scourge still to come. In 10 years we're gonna have 1 million, everybody, 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers. In 10 years we're gonna have 1 million lawyers. How much can the poor nation stand? I'm looking at Neil's face up here and he's going, did I invite this guy to speak here? Oh, a suffering world cries for mercy as far as the eye can see. Lawyers around every bend in the road, lawyers in every... I thought this was a college crowd. Tree. Lawyers in restaurants, lawyers in clubs, lawyers behind every door. Behind windows and potted plants, shade trees and shrubs, lawyers on pogo sticks, lawyers in politics. In 10 years we're gonna have 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers. Scary, isn't it? Million lawyers. How much can the poor nation stand? Well, in spring it's tornadoes and rampaging floods. In summer it's heat stroke and drought. There's Ivy League football to ruin the fall. It's a terrible scourge, without doubt. There are blizzards to batter the shivering plain. There are dust storms that strike, but far worse. There's the threat of disaster to shrivel the brain, the threat of implacable curse. Let's do a big finish here, okay? In 10 years we're gonna have 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers, 1 million lawyers. In 10 years we're gonna have 1 million lawyers. How much can the poor nation stand? How much can the poor nation stand? Give yourselves a hand. Well, no matter what you were expecting, when you heard a lawyer was speaking, you probably weren't expecting that, were you? Thank you again. And thank you, Neil, and thank you, Randall, for everything that you put together here. Now, I want to tell you that the really scary part of that song was that it was really written 10 years ago. We have almost 1 million lawyers now. And it is a scary song, isn't it? In a sense, funny, scary. But I chose that introduction in order to try to make a point to you. And I want to ask you this question. Why is it scary? Why is it scary, funny? Why is it uncomfortably funny? What's really wrong with having 100 or 1,000 or 1 million lawyers? Shouldn't it really be just the opposite? Shouldn't it really be a good thing to have 1 million men trained up that understand the law? Wouldn't it really be a blessing to have 1 million men strong who understood the true source of law and the true nature of law? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that what's really scary, what makes the song uncomfortably funny, is that the army of 1 million that the song conjures up in your mind is an army of men that doesn't understand the law at all, is it? It's a vision of a multitude of enemies that twist and pervert and sabotage and subvert the law and the legal process, isn't it? That's what it really conjures up. Howard Phillips made the joke when I made this comment before. He said, it's a shame that 99% of the attorneys in the country give the other 1% a bad name. It's really tragic. You see, we've drifted very far from an American understanding of law and government in this country. Randall, your speaker before, who introduced the session here and talked about Institute on the Constitution, really alluded to that. We've drifted very far from an American understanding of law and government. I've heard it said that if you consider the land, let's just use an illusion for a minute and say if the land was a constitutional republic of sovereign states based on biblical principles, okay, how we started, and we're in a boat next to the land, well, we've drifted out to sea, haven't we? We've drifted pretty far out to sea, haven't we? We're so far out to sea that we can't even see the land anymore. Because mostly when you go and talk about this in your community, they don't know what you're talking about. It's like you entered a room and everybody in the room is standing on their head and the whole room is on its head. You try to tell them they're upside down. And they think you're nuts. And you are the one that's upside down. Well, it's worse than that because, again, if here's the land and we've drifted out to sea, we've been out to sea so long that nobody remembers the land. They not only don't remember what the land looks like, we don't remember there is land. Because we've been out at sea here for a few generations now. And those who remembered the land are gone. And the landmarks have been taken away and taken away. The landmarks that would remind us of the land. Well, I've taken kind of an unscientific survey of attorneys and legislators and other community leaders, and I admit it's unscientific. But in my state, I'm from Annapolis, Maryland, nearby. I actually live in a place called Pasadena, Maryland. It's about midway between Baltimore and Annapolis. And I'm only about 15 minutes from the state capitol. And I have a lot of friends who are legislators and attorneys, obviously my colleagues. And I get very interesting answers, ladies and gentlemen, when I ask the question about the purpose of civil government. Not surprisingly, most of the answers have a distinctly socialist sentiment. They say things like this, and I'm sure you can add your own. They say things like, well, the purpose of government is to provide a level playing field. Or they say the purpose of government is to provide services that the people need. Okay. The purpose of government is to regulate business. Need that. And I'm sure you're starting to think of some of the things that you hear. If you go ask your legislator, go ask your attorney. What's the purpose of civil government? They'll say things like the purpose of government is to build and maintain the infrastructure. The purpose of government is to protect the children of the state. Now, I love this one because I didn't know the state had any children. I didn't know they had any. Don, I didn't even know the state was pregnant. The purpose of government is to provide a safety net for poor people or help people who can't help themselves or something like that. I've even heard this, and this is true. I feel like that Dave Barry, the comedian, he says, I'm not making this up. I'm not making this up. I had a friend tell me, when I said, what's the purpose of government? He says, it's to govern the people. Like, as if to say, Michael, what's wrong with you? The purpose of government is to govern the people. Well, it actually reminds me, I'm put in mind of the example that Doug Phillips, who runs Vision Forum, homeschool advocacy group, he shows a fish in the water on the screen. So he's got a fish in the water, a little bubble above the fish's head. Have you seen this? And the bubble says, am I wet? And the point of his illustration is that a fish doesn't understand what wet is. Fish has always lived in wet. Fish doesn't understand what dry is, so he doesn't understand what wet is. And the point is that if you've been swimming in a socialist pond for long enough, you lose all perspective of what socialism looks like. In other words, you can't see it in the sense of recognizing it because it's everywhere. You're saturated in it. Now, instead of all this, wouldn't you rather have, going back to the song, wouldn't you rather have 1,000,000 Thomas Jeffersons, for example, who claimed so clearly and so persuasively before all the world that the purpose of government, purpose of civil government, the reason why governments are formed among men is to protect life, liberty, and property, not to attack them. Wouldn't it be awesome to have 1,000,000 Jeffersons who understood that when government becomes destructive of its proper ends, it is the duty of a people to abolish it and to institute new government in its place? Wouldn't it be a blessing to have 1,000,000 men who understood that all law comes from a higher authority, and it is invalid and void if it does not contemplate and reflect that ultimate law and authority? Wouldn't it be a blessing to have 1,000,000 men who understood the unrevised history of America and its founding? Just think of 1,000,000 men faithful to the work and the vision of their fathers, men who understand that the founders were almost universally men of faith, and that it is inconceivable, ladies and gentlemen, that they would establish policies to limit the expression of that faith. The First Amendment actually says just the opposite of that. Consider the effect that 1,000,000 men trained up in the proper understanding of the history and heritage of their homeland could have. 1,000,000 men training their sons to emulate the example of the great lawyer and statesman Patrick Henry, for example. Such an army of men would undoubtedly provide real homeland security. And I just like to pause and enjoy that thought for a moment. 1,000,000 lawyers like Patrick Henry. We had 1,000,000 Patrick Henrys. That song I just sang wouldn't make any sense to you, would it? It wouldn't be funny or uncomfortable. Imagine 1,000,000 lawyers like John Jay. Just this about John Jay. He was the first Chief Justice of the United States, and he was a founder of the American Bible Society. Ladies and gentlemen, just let that sink in for a second where we are today. He was the first Chief Justice of the United States, and he was the founder of the American Bible Society. Can you imagine that today? See how far we've drifted out to sea. Imagine 1,000,000 lawyers who grasp the significance of the study done by two professors, and you learned about this in the Institute on the Constitution class, those of you who just graduated. Two professors, Donald Lutz and Charles Heinemann, who reviewed over 15,000 items and closely read 2,200 books, pamphlets, newspaper articles, and monographs with explicitly political content printed between 1760 and 1805. From this extensive research, Lutz and Heinemann identified 3,154 references by the framers of our Constitution to other sources. In other words, what were our framers reading? What were they quoting? What were they using as a source of authority? Well, the source most often cited by the Founding Fathers was the Bible. Thank you. Which accounted for 34% of all the citations. 34%. Deuteronomy, the fifth book, was referred to frequently due to its heavy emphasis on biblical law. The study went on to identify other sources most frequently cited by the framers, which include Baron Charles Montesquieu, Sir William Blackstone, and Sir Edward Coke. Fully half of the sources cited by our founders came from either Montesquieu or Blackstone or the Holy Scriptures. And of course, Montesquieu and Blackstone were quoting what? Friends, here is the mind and the mission of America revealed. Would that we had an army of 1 million men who remembered it and recognized its significance. In the last presidential election, there was one man who ran for this high office who understood these things. I believe that if Howard Phillips would have, if elected president, appointed U.S. attorneys who understood the true purpose of civil government, and I dare say not only U.S. attorneys, but ministers in all of the executive branch, who would have acted on the beliefs that our forefathers shared and enshrined in the structure of our republic. Imagine if we had 1 million lawyers who, like the founders of America, shared a belief in God and his providence, by which he guides and controls the universe and the affairs of mankind. Imagine that we had 1 million lawyers who, like the founders of America, shared the recognition that God has revealed himself through the Holy Scriptures. That's what they believed. Imagine that we had 1 million lawyers who, like the founders of America, shared the recognition that man is not a perfect nor a perfectible being, and that governmental theories and governmental structures and governmental programs need to reflect that fact and take it into account. Imagine 1 million lawyers who, like the founders of America, understood that God has ordained human government to restrain the exercise of sin, not to regenerate man, not to save us. Law doesn't save us. It merely restrains the exercise of sin. Rushdoony writes on this quite extensively and quite brilliantly. Imagine 1 million lawyers who, like the founders of America, okay, imagine 100. If you're wearying of 1 million. Imagine 100, imagine 10, give me 10 men who understood that the human law must correspond to the divine law and the law of nature, and that human laws which contradict the divine law are invalid and non-binding and ought to be resisted, and are to be resisted. Imagine 1 million lawyers who, like the founders of America, understood that revealed law and natural law form the basis for the law of nations, and that this law of nations includes the right of a nation to defend itself against aggressors without having to curtsy, kowtow, genuflect to United Nations or any other international group. Imagine 1 million lawyers who, like Thomas Jefferson and the founders of America, understood that life, liberty, and property are inalienable. Why? Precisely because they come from God. Precisely because of their divine origin, that they can't be taken away by men. They're not granted by the Constitution. They're not granted by men. They're granted by God. They're simply recognized in the Constitution. That's why they're inalienable. Imagine 1 million lawyers that understand that governments are formed by covenant or compact of the people in order to safeguard those rights. Imagine 1 million lawyers who understand that governments have only such powers as are delegated to them by the people in the covenant or compact, and that when governments attempt to usurp powers that are outside that compact and that are not so delegated, they become illegitimate and ought to be resisted. Imagine 1 million lawyers who understood that human nature being what it is, rulers tend to usurp more and more power if they were given the opportunity to do so, and that human nature being what it is, a free enterprise economy, is the best way to give people an incentive to produce and develop national prosperity. Well, sadly, this is not where our public education system, nor our legal education system in America, is taking us. Joseph Sobran, in his essay, How Tyranny Came to America, and those of you who took the class read that, writes that one of the great goals of education is to initiate the young in the conversations of their ancestors, to enable them to understand the language of that conversation in all its subtlety, and maybe in their maturity to add to it some wisdom of their own. So the language of our ancestors enables us to understand them. Sobran indicts the American educational system, claiming that it no longer teaches us the political language of our ancestors. In fact, our schooling helps to widen the gulf of time between our ancestors and ourselves. Because much of what we are taught in the name of civics or political science or American history or social science, as someone referred to tonight, is really modern liberal propaganda. Sometimes this is deliberate. Sometimes, as Sobran says, worse, it's not. I'm not sure I agree with him. I think it's worse that it's deliberate. Anyway, he goes on, quoting him again. He says, "Our ancestral voices have come to sound alien to us, and therefore our own moral and political language is impoverished. It's as if the people of England could no longer understand Shakespeare, or the German people couldn't comprehend Mozart, Beethoven." And by your leave, I'd like to repeat that, because that's really the profound part of the quote that made me choose it to tell to you. It's as if the people of England could no longer understand Shakespeare, or the people of Germany. The German people couldn't comprehend Mozart or Beethoven. That's our situation, because we can't understand our own ancestors. So far out to sea, and we've been there so long. Ladies and gentlemen, those who exerted significant influence in the founding of America, those who provided prominent leadership in the founding of America, those who had a substantial impact upon the birth, development, and establishment of America as an independent, self-governing nation, understood, perhaps like no group of founders before them, their unique place in history. They overwhelmingly shared a worldview that was biblically based. This worldview, along with the unique historical situation which allowed them to consider and choose the form of government they would adopt, rather than having it thrust upon them, which is the usual historic situation, led them to consider the nature of man and his relationship to God in considering the structure and form of civil government that they would adopt. They realized, you see, that man was a fallen creature and that he would tend toward evil. They realized that Lord Acton's famous admonition that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely applied to mankind collectively as well as individually. They knew that if enough power and authority were concentrated in a few hands, that injustice and tyranny and chaos would be the result and would be the rule. The concepts of separation of powers and checks and balances owe their existence to the recognition of the framers that concentration of power leads to evil. And they were found in the minds of the framers because they found them in Scripture. In addition to the idea of checks and balances and separation of powers, many other very recognizable elements of our legal system and legal procedure find their origin in Scripture as well, including the right to a trial by jury, the right to face your accusers and question one's accusers, as well as many other rights, including the right to life itself. Well, we don't have 1 million Patrick Henrys. But you knew that when you came in here tonight, didn't you? Maybe we don't even have 100 Patrick Henrys. But we do have some true American heroes in our midst. We have Howard Phillips, that I referred to before. We have his attorney's son, Doug Phillips, who I also quoted. We have attorneys like Darrell Castle in Tennessee and Jim Clymer in Pennsylvania. We have jurists like Chief Justice Roy Moore. We have congressmen like Ron Paul. In my state of Maryland, and maybe I could talk more about this a little later, but we have a very encouraging situation. Out of our first class, you're graduating your first class here, out of our first class, we were hoping to raise up someone to run for public office. We weren't even sure what office he'd run for. But we were hoping to get one candidate. And out of our class, we got a candidate, and we got his treasurer who worked with him. The candidate's name was Don Dwyer. He was one of the first 22. You have 34, 36 that graduated tonight. Our first class had 22. Don Dwyer became convicted as a result of the class and what he had learned and what he wanted to show his children and his posterity. And he decided to place himself on the ballot, run for the Maryland House of Delegates in my district, District 31 in Maryland. And on November 5th, he was elected. We have a graduate of Institute on the Constitution who saw the very things that you saw in this class and became convicted perhaps the very same way you have, who was a member of, he's got a seat now. That, my friends, is extremely encouraging for God to grant that victory. We didn't really expect it. As a matter of fact, we weren't prepared for it. We actually were more prepared to not win than we were prepared to win, and now we got a lot of work to do to figure out what to do now that we won. So there's a flurry of activity. The session begins, by the way, January 8th. He's sworn in, and but that's a tremendous blessing. And I don't mean to digress, but I'll tell you more about that later. But what a terrific validation of Institute on the Constitution. One of our own got a seat. We have to stop ceding the civil government to the pagans. Matthew 28:18 says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. All authority. All. Any questions? All. There's not some pigeonhole of a jurisdiction over here somewhere that Jesus Christ is not the Lord of. That includes civil government. Civil government is, of course, ordained. Caesar does have a jurisdiction. Christ pointed that out when he said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. As John Eidsmoe pointed out in the lecture series, for those of you who were not part of the IOC, he recognized Caesar's jurisdiction, but he said it was limited. At the same time, he showed that it was limited. Christ in Matthew 28 says, all authority has been given to me. Go therefore and disciple all nations. So we've got to stop ceding this and saying it's secular or neutral or something. Anyway, God continually raises up men who will be faithful and will give us faithful example. But whether we have 10 or 100 or 1,000, it matters not, ladies and gentlemen, because our job, our mission, is still the same. So what do we do? Well, we train up 1 million Patrick Henrys. That's it. We train up 1 million Patrick Henrys. We train up 1 million godly men who understand the proper purpose of government, and then we train up 1 million more. And all the while we are doing it, and while it seems impossible, we remind ourselves and our children that it is a joy to labor in His field, and that we should thank Him mightily for the mighty work that He has given us to do. So how do we do it? Well, I don't have every answer. I don't have every dot connected for that. But I can tell you that I recently attended, back in July, the Witherspoon School of Law and Public Policy in Luray, Virginia. Don and I were talking about it a little while ago. And that's sponsored by Doug Phillips and his organization, Vision Forum. And I saw with my own eyes 100 men who were anxious and willing to learn about the fundamental principles that form the bedrock of our republic. Many of them were young men, and it was an encouragement to see them and to witness their desire to follow the ancient landmarks of freedom under God's law. I saw men under the direction of Dr. Paul Jaley of the Plymouth Rock Foundation, young men who are knowledgeable and articulate about the truth they are learning about American history and American government. Very articulate. Ladies and gentlemen, I am hopeful by what I have seen. For my part, I can give you a report, and some of you, again, if you took this class, will know more about this, but for those of you who haven't, I can give you a brief report on what we've been doing in Maryland and what other like-minded souls like you have been doing across America. About 3 years ago, along with the help and support of my wife and my wife Diane and my children Beth, Patrick, and Tim, and my brilliant and generous brother and law partner, Stephen, I began an educational outreach program that we entitled Institute on the Constitution. It began as an effort to teach the rudiments of constitutional law and constitutional history to citizens of our local community in Anne Arundel County, and you pronounced it correctly, thank you. In a way, folks, though, this is nothing more than remedial civics. I say that because we should have all learned the basic structure and underlying principles of government as youngsters, should we? But almost universally, we didn't. And Cammie gave a good historical situation of that, description of that as well, if you're over 50 and if you're between 20 and 50. Almost universally, we really didn't get this. So there's no use crying or belly aching about it now. We just have to do it. I emphasize the belly aching part and moaning because that's really what my brother Steve and I did for a number of years. We moaned, belly ached about the fact that none of our legal colleagues seemed to have any constitutional understanding, and few of our legislators seemed to understand the dangerous things they were approving. And the judges in Maryland were just totally lost. It's not even worth mentioning them. Moreover, no one seemed to give a fig about the fact that constitutional principles and procedural safeguards were disappearing. After sufficient moaning, however, Steve and I decided that it was time to stop cursing the darkness and throwing shoes at the television and maybe try to light a candle instead. So we wrote letters to a number of our colleagues and our business associates, our friends, and our extended families, and we invited them to come to a study group to meet every 2 weeks. Later, we changed it to once a week throughout the winter. This was in the year 2000. This is January of 2000. We found a lecture series on videotape that we could use as a starting point. It's entitled, as you know, Institute on the Constitution, and was delivered by Dr. John Eidsmoe, an author, lecturer, and professor of constitutional law at Faulkner University in Montgomery, Alabama. The course consists, as was described here earlier, of a series of 12 half-hour lectures that explore the background, the history, and structure of our constitutional republic. By using this course and the accompanying materials, we explored and discussed the religious beliefs of the Founding Fathers, the philosophical worldview of the Founding Fathers. We examined the history of the period. We sought to understand why the Founding Fathers chose the form of government that they did after declaring their and winning their independence and their sovereignty from the English crown. Now, here's my commercial, okay? Institute on the Constitution lends itself perfectly as a semester study for a church or for neighborhood groups. In our case, watching and listening to the tapes led to many provocative and insightful discussions among the participants. I'm sure that happened here. We were kidding before about we had the meeting, and then there was the meeting after the meeting in the hallway, and then down on the parking lot, there was the meeting after the meeting after the meeting. Actually, it's been a great success, and it led to a radio program of the same name, which we've been doing in Annapolis for over 2 years. And I'm also privileged to co-host a program called the Veritas Hour, which is on a kind of a bigger station in the Baltimore area. And we tackle many difficult topics that deal with the application of constitutional principles in the culture today. But our foray into Institute on the Constitution has led to something even more important that you're witnessing here tonight. Though we've had about 200 people complete our course in the last 2.5 years, that's really only part of the story, due to a great deal of work on the part of Don Dwyer, who served for 2 years as the director of the American College for Cultural Studies, and then, as I explained to you, he went and got himself elected, so now he's busy. But through his efforts, the course has been shown and taught around the country. We call this program Across America, and through the help of many people and people in this room, Neil and Randall and Bob and Don and others, Institute on the Constitution has spread across America, and it's been presented over 65 times in over 23 states. This is most encouraging. It's not 1 million, but it's over a couple of thousand now, and it's very, very encouraging. To facilitate the program, we developed what we call a host lecture kit, and Neil's been nice enough to put some out in the back here, that's designed to make the presentation of the lecture series an easy task for most folks, even if you're not conversant with the Constitution or American history at all. The kit contains videotapes, a workbook, lecture notes, review questions, discussion questions, and other documents which help you to host the series yourself. And it also provides you with a way to contact us if you need help. I tell you all of this Because I want to urge you to consider starting your own Institute on the Constitution lecture series in your community. You don't have to be an attorney to host this program, and as a matter of fact, as you heard me say to some of the ladies up here, if you listen through these lectures, you will know more constitutional law and American history than most attorneys, at least those of my acquaintance. And I'm not, please don't get me wrong, I don't mean to be self-righteous about that. Ladies and gentlemen, I went through law school, and I knew who Blackstone was, but I didn't know who Blackstone was. And my meaning there is that I saw Blackstone's commentaries in footnotes, and etc. And I knew that it was a compilation of something in England. But I thought it was the evolutionary experience of the English people, because I was taught in an evolutionary kind of mindset. And all law schools, with the exception of very few, follow that approach, because it lends itself to then you understand the casebook, then you accept, excuse me, the casebook method and the stare decisis method, which takes you away from constitutional law. At any rate, talking about Blackstone, I had no idea until I'd been practicing law for 17, 19 years that Blackstone was quoting Exodus and Deuteronomy. And I had no idea. I'm not trying to give the impression of a vast conspiracy against Michael Peroutka, but I think it was on purpose that I didn't have any idea. I mean, I think it was intentional. I could develop that theme for you, but I think you know where I'm coming from. These landmarks and this understanding of our history is being removed all the time. So anyway, if the Spirit moves you to host an Institute on the Constitution program in your town or in your neighborhood or in your church, call me or call Neil or call Randall. We will help you. It's what we're about. Now, I'd just like to close this part by suggesting that it is your civic duty to know your constitutional history and to understand your constitutional heritage. Moreover, it is your godly duty to teach this to your children. And I'm so encouraged to see so many children and young people in this room today. I thank you for that. I meant to make that comment earlier, but I thank you very much for that. They won't get it at any government school, and they most likely won't get it in most private schools either. You are compelled and conscripted to teach this to your children by your duty to pass on the blessings of freedom. They are your posterity. See, Thomas Jefferson understood this truth. The primary author of the Declaration of Independence once wrote these words. He said, "Anyone who desires to be ignorant and free desires what never was and never will be." Jefferson understood, as did all of our founding fathers, that a people ignorant of its own past, its own history, is doomed to be an oppressed and enslaved people. So I urge you to be free and to raise your children for God. There was another colleague of mine in the legal profession, he practiced law in Maryland about 200 years ago. He was a lover of freedom, and he wrote poetry, and I'd like to share some of his poetry with you now. He actually wrote this piece on a British ship just outside of Baltimore Harbor, not far from where I live, but he was from Frederick, Maryland. And I'd like you to sing it with me. It goes like this. For thus be it ever when free men shall stand, and I'd ask you to stand, between their loved homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that gave and preserved us a nation. So conquer we must when the cause it is just, and this be our motto, sing it, in God is our trust, and the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.